very nice. And he did a great job there.
Yeah. No, he was the best on the entire board.
Oh, you're very kind. You're very kind. But it's really, I'm going to mention today on how Indians and Brazilians become friends in international organizations, because we are so distant geographically, but instantly in international organizations, Indians and Brazilians become friends.
So true.
Sir, it is 5 o'clock and we are ready to begin.
Very well.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to Pune International Center's Ambassador Speaks series. I am Abhay Vidya, Associate Director. We are honored to have with us today His Excellency Mr. André A. Correa da Lago, Ambassador of Brazil in India. He will be speaking to us on Brazil and its neighbors' security through diplomacy. His Excellency Ambassador Correa do Lago has a degree in economics from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and he is an alumnus of the Brazilian Diplomatic Academy. As a diplomat since 1983, he has served at a number of Brazilian embassies, including those at Madrid, Washington, D.C., and as ambassador to Japan. His Excellency has worked in areas such as trade, promotion, international organizations, sustainable development, energy and climate change, and he was Director General of the Departments of Energy and Environment of the Ministry of External Relations. Mr. Correa do Lago was also the chief negotiator for climate change during 2011-2013 and for Rio +20 UN Conference of 2012. He is the author of a series of books and articles on sustainable development and also on architecture. Sir, you would be happy to know that energy, environment, and climate change is one of the focus areas at Pune International Center Policy Research Think Tank.
Wonderful.
And international relations and national security are also among our other focus areas. And this series, Ambassador Speaks series, has been initiated by our Vice President, Dr. Kelkar, and our member and former Foreign Secretary of India, Dr. Vijay Gokhale. This is the fourth event in the Ambassador Speaks series, and today's webinar will be chaired by Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, PIC trustee and former Indian ambassador to China, Bhutan, and High Commissioner to Pakistan. We will first have the welcome address by our President, Dr. R.A. Mashilkar, followed by the opening remarks by Ambassador Bambawale. This webinar is interactive, and we will have a question and answer session after the talk by His Excellency. You are welcome to post your questions in the Q&A box. I wish to welcome all of you once again, and may I now request Dr. Mashilkar to kindly take the floor.
Thank you very much. His Excellency Mr. André Correa da Lago, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, distinguished members of Pune International Center, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to extend a very warm welcome to His Excellency as our most distinguished guest for our stellar series, Ambassador Speaks. We launched this new series, Ambassador Speaks, to learn about this new global geopolitical dynamic, to learn about the view of India as seen through the lens of great global thought leaders, and especially the distinguished ambassadors of different nations who have a special view from a vantage position. We have so far had the privilege of ambassadors from France, from South Korea, from Bangladesh honoring us. Thank you, Excellency, for doing us the honor today. Brazil, India looks at as a great nation, a great friend of India that we greatly love and admire. We both share a very close and multifaceted relationship at the bilateral level. We are also partners in many plurilateral fora, such as Brics, BASIC, G20, G4, as well as multilateral bodies such as UN, WTO, UNESCO, WIPO, etc. Brazil was the first Latin American country to establish diplomatic relations with India as early as 1948. Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, our then Vice President of India, made a visit in 1954, and since then, there have been several official visits by our honorable presidents and prime ministers of both nations. We also very fondly recollect the state visit by Brazil's honorable president, uh, Mr. Bolsonaro, to India in January 2020 at the invitation of our honorable Prime Minister Shri Modi. We are proud to see him as the chief guest at India's Republic Day Parade. That's a very special event in the year for India. We take pride in that. Our two countries began strategic partnership in 2006, but during this last January 2020 visit, an action plan to strengthen that strategic partnership with a strong roadmap and a major revitalization were developed. The 15 MOUs and agreements that have been signed are both deep and diverse, not only including areas of mutual interest, but also cooperation in global issues of mutual interest. As strategic partners, India and Brazil have set up several robust institutional relationships. I particularly wish to refer to the Program on Science and Technology Cooperation that has been signed. His Excellency, I am a scientist, and let me mention about my admiration for Brazil. I have made a number of visits to Brazil, as a matter of fact, and I was really impressed to see the progress that you have made. You know, whether it was the creation in 1972 of the Brazilian Agriculture Research Company, Embrapa, which was decisive in making Brazil a world leader in tropical agriculture, or whether it was Petrobras, which developed the technology for deep water oil drilling that eventually led to self-sufficiency in fossil fuels, or whether it was the aeronautics industry with Embraer, becoming one of the largest aircraft manufacturers in the world by focusing on specific market segments. And I wish to share with you, where I was the Director General of CSIR, our National Aerospace Laboratory was developing a 14-seater civilian aircraft. And we used to look at what you did with Embraer as a model that we should follow. The Embraer has been a fantastic global success. And most importantly, you have shown a great resilience. You know, in 1970s, when you were hit by an oil crisis, the creation of Pearl-Cool bioethanol program was a real game changer. And you became the world leader in bioethanol. Our Honorable Prime Minister has asked us to be Atmanirbhar. Atmanirbhar means self-reliant, with self-confidence. And you demonstrated how you could become Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, by going for bioethanol at that time. And this is a great example for us to follow. And I must also say that Brazil-India have always thought alike. When our Honorable Prime Minister Modi proposed the idea of International Solar Alliance as a way to combat the climate change challenge, and you yourself have been sort of involved deeply in this issue, His Excellency, Brazil readily partnered in this global call. I especially wish to mention about this challenge in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we were discussing before we began. It's very unfortunate that as we are holding this important event, both Brazil and India are facing the challenge of exponentially rising cases of COVID-19, some fall, but still huge damage to lives and livelihoods. And in this, we are together. Prime Minister Modi responded immediately, as you remember, to the calls by the Honorable President of Brazil, whether it was last year in April for hydrochloroquine tablets, or this year in January for 2 million doses of finished AstraZeneca vaccine that is produced, by the way, in this very city of Pune by Serum Institute of India. So Brazil and India have been partners even in times of adversity, as also our journey in future together in prosperity. Finally, our relationship is based on solid fundamentals. We both share common global vision, share democratic values, and commitment to foster inclusive economic growth for the welfare of the people of both countries. The inclusion part of it, I just want to take sort of a minute or so. I remember I was the vice chairman of the WHO's Commission on Intellectual Property Rights, Innovation and Public Health. Madame Ruth Raffers of former Switzerland president was the chairperson And I remember visiting Brazil at that time. And the crucial issues were IPR. And I could quite clearly see that Brazil had taken a view. It is not intellectual property rights versus the rights of the poor. It is intellectual property rights and the rights of the poor. That's inclusion. And that was terrific. So I want to especially acknowledge that as a personal experience. With these few words, I once again warmly welcome you on behalf of the entire family of Pune International Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, oh, it's my turn, or can I speak?
Sir, Ambassador Bambawale will now make the opening remarks.
Your Excellency, I'll take just 2 minutes because I think our President, Dr. Mashelkar, has spoken a lot about India and Brazil, and he's covered much of the topic, and I don't want to stand between you and our audience, which is looking forward to listening to you. I'll only say that, although India and Brazil may geographically be a little far from each other, we always have thought on similar lines, and we continue to think today on similar lines. And we think alike on most of the global issues of the day. There are, of course, many different kinds of institutions where we are members. First of all, we have IBSA or IBSA, which is India, Brazil, and South Africa, which is 3 different countries, 3 democracies on 3 separate continents coming together. Then there is, of course, Brics, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And the next Brics summit is to be held here in India sometime in the second half of this year. And I know, Excellency, that you will be very busy with your president visiting. I hope by then physical meetings will be allowed and that we'll be able to have the presidents of the 4 other countries coming to India. But today, Ambassador André Arana Correa do Lago is going to speak to us about Brazil and its neighbors, security through diplomacy. And I think this has great relevance for all of us here in India because, as you know, Ambassador, we live in a difficult neighborhood. I myself have served in both Pakistan and China. And therefore, we are wondering if there are any lessons to be learned from India, from Brazil's experience. I think there will be, and there will be a lot of questions on that line, I am confident, after you have made your presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to you, Excellency, and request you to make your presentation on Brazil and its neighbors, security through diplomacy. Ambassador, the floor is yours, please.
Well, Ambassador Bambawale, thank you very much for your words. I don't believe there will be any lesson, but it is an enormous pleasure to be able to share a bit of this history that I believe has some experiences that are extremely interesting and that we can share. I totally agree with you. Your president, Mr. Mashelkar, made a wonderful presentation. By the way, I'm going to copy your presentation to explain my country to India, because you touched all these wonderful elements from Embrapa to Embraer, to Petrobras, etc. All these institutions that make us very proud of our country. And I was very touched by your presentation, Mr. Mashelkar, and I thank you very much. And I have to say that the last visit that we had to the Indian soil by a high authority from Brazil was the Ministry of Science and Technology, who came to watch the Indian rocket take a Brazilian satellite. And so this was a wonderful moment of bilateral relations, and he was here a few months ago in an extremely successful visit, and he was delighted. He discovered a bit like you how much relationship we can have in science and technology between our countries and that we still have not established. So as an ambassador, I'll try to contribute to this. Mr. Vaidya, thank you very much also for your words. But I have to thank very specially my dear friend Gokli for the invitation for today. I'm very honored to be an ambassador speaking today at the Pune International Center. And Ambassador Gokli, by the way, was the Foreign Secretary when I was arriving here in India. And by the way, he is the one who told me that he called me at the MEA to tell me that my president was going to be the guest of the Republic Day. And it was a very special day, a very special meeting. And I remember that very fondly, as well as all the opportunities we were together, dear friend. So, yes, I chose this theme, but I just found out that you all also love energy and climate change. So if I behave well, I would be delighted to participate again in an event to talk about these subjects, but only if you think that I am, I deserve to be invited again. But I'll be absolutely delighted because these themes are fascinating themes, and so I will be delighted to participate in a discussion or whatever that you want. So why did I choose this subject? Because I understand that, and I just had the proof that you all know a lot already about Brazil, and that you all have this very, very clear vision of how strategic the friendship between our countries has to be. So instead of making a presentation on our relations, which is something that I believe you are all very much know almost as much as me, if not more. But I thought of presenting to you a vision of my region, because obviously for me as a Brazilian ambassador, discovering all the complexity of your neighborhood, as you pointed out, Ambassador Bambawale, is, I think, the complexity of the Latin American continent is very much underrated. Underrated in the sense that it has been, it's a region that is not an international concern, but not because we're not relevant, but amazingly thanks to diplomacy. So I think that is the point that I wanted to raise today and tell a bit the story of what happened in Latin America, which is something that most people, even our former colonizers, don't understand very well, how we reached that kind of agreement that allowed us to be what I sustain the most peaceful region in the world in the 20th century. And I'm going to come to that to talk to you about that. So so this is somehow a provocation to tell you, look, we are not an international concern because we worked on it. It's not because of accidents or because of things that we didn't control. No, this is a decision of our region that we wanted to concentrate much more on cooperation than on rivalries. And I think that Brazil played a very important role in this. So my first slide, so that you get rid of me. So that's second, please. Second slide. Yeah. So these are the basic numbers just to remind you about Brazil. I think that when we give our GDP, we are very proud of our GDP, but suddenly India in 5 years passed completely Brazil in GDP. And we're very happy that it's India that passed us, but we still have a significant economy. We are the 9th economy in the world, so our two countries are among the 10. We have a reasonable, as you can see, per capita GDP, but very, very important, I think, is the issue of our differences. I mean, because the population, Brazil is a country that only has 1/6 of the population of India, But in area, we are the double of the size of India. And land borders, which is the main subject today, we have land borders with 10 countries, which is quite impressive. And we have the third largest border, territorial border in the world after Russia and China, with 16,000 kilometers. These numbers about forested areas, something that I insist to put because the issue of the Amazon is an issue that probably is going to be a subject of one of the questions of yours. But I just wanted to remember that in spite of all the numbers and the news and all the bad news about the Amazon, which, by the way, are mostly true, we still have in Brazil the entire territory of India that is untouched forest. So just for you to have an idea of the proportion. So sometimes my Indian friends are very worried about deforestation in Brazil. I say, yes, it got worse. Yes, we have to do many things. But in fact, we still have an entire India. And big part of the problem of deforestation is how do you protect such a huge size of territory. But let's go straight to our subject. Next one, please. We call Brazil, we say that Brazil is the child of diplomacy. Why? Because all the borders of Brazil were dealt by agreements. So the first, as you remember, the division of the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese in 1494 was this line of Tordesilhas that you can see, the vertical line in the middle of Brazil. And this was supposed to be the Portuguese Brazil in the end of the 15th century. But when this line was drawn, Brazil had not been discovered yet, amazingly. And the Spanish had discovered land, which is on the west side of that line. So they didn't expect that there was such a big territory on the east side. But anyway, so the Portuguese occupied this east part of that line. And little by little, during 200 and some years, the Brazilians advanced to the west. So in 1750, still under the Portuguese crown and still a colony of Portugal, a Brazilian diplomat, that is the fun part, is a boy that was born in near São Paulo, educated in Bahia in the northeast of Brazil, and became one of the most important counselors of the King of Portugal, negotiated the Treaty of Madrid, in which he more than doubled Brazil's size by using two arguments. One is that we had to take into consideration where people were, and we have to take into consideration where the rivers and the mountains are as natural borders. And we had an enormous ally, which were the Andes, because as you know, for the Spanish that conquered South America through the Pacific, it was very difficult to cross the Andes to arrive in the Amazon. So they concentrated their cares in that negotiation on the south of Brazil, because they wanted to keep the control of the Rio de la Plata, of the River Plate, between what today is Uruguay and Argentina, and that goes on into the continent. So this negotiation was made in a quite brilliant way. And this is the map that was decided under the colonization. And it's so similar to today's Brazil, which you can see in green. So this is already the first diplomatic step of the definition of our territory. Next slide. But Brazil's independence is a very curious story. Brazil was a colony of Portugal since 1500 until 1822. But something very surprising happened in 1808, is when Napoleon decided to invade Portugal. The Portuguese king moved to Brazil with the entire court, escorted by the British. So they crossed the Atlantic and they transferred the capital of the Portuguese Empire to Rio de Janeiro. So it's a bit like if in 1939, the British had decided to move the capital of the British Empire to New Delhi. So it's basically something like that. So they moved to Rio. The king lived in Rio for many years, almost 10 years. And he went back to Portugal after the final defeat of Napoleon. And he left in Brazil his son as a viceroy. And this son, a few years later, seeing that Brazil had very strong movement pro-independence, decided to declare independence from Portugal himself. So from viceroy of Brazil and son of the King of Portugal, he became the Emperor of Brazil in 1822. This created a very special circumstance, because compared to all our neighbors, the former Spanish colonies who had to fight Spain and created republics, Brazil didn't fight Portugal the way the others fought Spain. It was almost a Freudian process, of a son against his father. And thanks to that, Brazil kept its integrity, which is something that did not happen with the former colonies of Spain. So Brazil was run by emperors in a rather democratic, for the time, with the constitution from 1822 until 1889. So we were for more than 75 years, for more than 65 years, we were a monarchy. And during this period, there wasn't so much attention to our neighborhood. And we were seen in Latin America as a threat, because we were seen as still the representatives of Europe, the representatives of an old world in the Americas. In that period, Brazil had its last war, which was with Paraguay. Today, it sounds very strange. You see there the image of Paraguay, and you see the size of the two countries. But in fact, Paraguay had a much larger army and navy than Brazil, river navy. And it was necessary to have Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay together to defeat Paraguay. So we had this war that had a very, very strong negative impact on the monarchy. And little by little, the Republican movement in Brazil ended up winning. And in 1889, we became a republic. And then at that moment, Brazil assumed its circumstance. You know that I like very much a sentence by Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, who says, I am I and my circumstance. So Brazil had to assume its circumstance. It was in South America. It had to deal with its circumstance. And so the Republic created this series of negotiations, as you can see, for some of the pending issues regarding its borders, because between an agreement that the colony, a colony of Portugal, was imposed somehow by the Portuguese metropolis, we now were a republic surrounded by republics, and we had to agree on the imprecise borders that naturally still exist. As you remember, at that time also the Guyanas were, one was Dutch, one was British, and one was French. So there were also negotiations with these small colonies that still continued in South America in the early 20th century. But the important point is the following: we we not only negotiated with our neighbors for a peace treaty and for a border treaty, but when we could not get a negotiation that was effective, we used arbitration. And so we have a series that is quite interesting. As you can see, in Argentina in 1895, we had an arbitration, and the arbiter was the president of the United States, Grover Cleveland, and it was decided for Brazil. Then in 1900, we had an arbitration for a border with French Guyana. It was the Swiss Confederation president that arbitered in favor also of Brazil. Then we had a negotiation with Bolivia in 1903 that increased the Brazilian territory because Brazilians were already living in that area. That was in 1903. Then we had an arbitration with the United Kingdom, which is the only arbitration we lost. The King of Italy was the arbiter, and he favored Great Britain in 1904. Then Colombia in 1907 accepted the borders because, as you can see, Colombia has an undefined border with Brazil because it's all in the Amazon. And finally, Peru also agreed its borders with Brazil in 1909. So that foreign minister of the beginning of the Republic, called Rio Branco, is the patron of Brazilian diplomats, because when he died, he had solved all the pending border issues between Brazil and its neighbors. And I'm talking to you about 1909. So from that moment on, in which Brazil had its security totally fulfilled somehow, Brazil started to have a very stabilizing role in the region, and could be a very constructive power. Even if we are 50% of the entire continent, we are 50% of South America, Brazil didn't have any issues pending with any of its neighbors and could concentrate on that very constructive agenda. So this integration was achieved little by little, because naturally these borders, as I told you, the border with Venezuela, with Colombia, with Peru and Bolivia, they're all borders next to the Amazon forest. So it's very difficult to define border. But the fact is that we tried to find the way of integrate our country to the neighbors in the different circumstances. So this process in the 20th century advanced in a very positive way, but I have to stress that the main steps for the most advanced cooperation that I'm going to show to you were achieved in the 1880s and 1890s, after that we had achieved in most of South America the end of the military regimes, because there was a moment in the 60s and early 70s in which many of the countries of South America, we had military regimes. The reason for that, I don't need to tell you obviously, is essentially because of the Cold War and how the US wanted to avoid governments that could have a tendency to go towards Soviet Union's interests, like it had happened in Cuba. So America was particularly sensitive about South America because they didn't want a second Cuba. So we had military regimes in Chile, in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Uruguay, Peru. Basically, we had these governments that were very obsessed with anti-communism and sovereignty. So in the 80s and 90s, and even more with the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, South America was left much more to itself by the Americans and in general by the world. And we could start to build our own trust structure that we thought was necessary for this to advance. So I'm going to mention to you, next please. I'm going to mention to you that, as I said in the beginning as a provocation, it's not only Brazil that basically solved this problem with the neighbors, but I want to show you the map of 1900 and the map of 2000 of South America. And you will see the proof that it is the continent in the world, apart obviously from North America, but North America only has 3 countries, but it's the region of the world that had less changes of borders in the 20th century. So the image of Latin America as a mess, as we are always with revolutions, etc., is somehow a smoke screen that hides the 2 great realities. This is the region of the world that had less changes in borders in the 20th century. And this is the region of the world that had less wars and that had the less violent governments. And that you may think, well, I'm delirating a little because we had all the military regime. But by even let's say the staunchest critic against the military regimes in Brazil, in Latin America in general, the worst regime is considered the Argentinian or the Chilean. Argentina, even if you take the highest numbers, had 30,000 deaths during the military regime. Chile, 10,000 deaths. In Brazil, and this is an official number by a commission, the Democratic Commission, after the end of the military regime, we had less than 500 deaths during the military regime. So this is to say that South America is in fact an extraordinarily balanced and peaceful region of the world. And we can talk about that after my presentation on how the world like to portray our countries, stressing the problems and not stressing the achievements. So among the greatest achievements, I believe, regarding the post-1980s advances, I would like to stress to you one that used to occupy a lot the analysts in the 1970s, which was to make a parallel between Brazilian and Argentinian rivalry and compare it to India-Pakistan rivalry. So since this is very much in the literature of the 70s, when all of us were babies, obviously, we barely remember the 1970s. But the fact is that we had, it's true, 2 military regimes, both in Brazil and Argentina, that were developing nuclear weapons. And the rivalry between Brazil and Argentina was very much accentuated by these military regimes. Once democracy came, there was an immediate effort on both sides to create a very constructive policy regarding nuclear development. The first landmark was in '85, the Iguazu Declaration, in which the 2 newly democratic, re-democratic countries decided that in spite of being fully, or very close to fully mastering the technologies of nuclear fuel cycle, stimulated instead the bilateral strategic competition. So as a result of that, we created in 1991 the Brazilian-Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Material, which we call ABAC, which is an extraordinary decision in which we stopped both of our programs. And later, we offered the Atomic Energy Agency to an agreement in which they would be able to guarantee that all nuclear materials in both countries would be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. So Argentina acceded to the NPT in 1995. We took much longer. We had a very traditional position in the NPT together with India, by the way. But we ended up getting into the NTP a few years later, in the 90s. But at the same time, Mexico and the other Latin American countries organized to have the first nuclear weapon-free zone in an inhabited area was signed in Mexico, the Tlatelolco Treaty of 1967. So we all know that the first nuclear weapon-free zone was declared for Antarctica in the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. But the Tlatelolco is the first one in inhabited area. And it determined the prohibition of nuclear weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. And both Brazil and Argentina and all the countries have joined the Tlatelolco Agreement. It was somehow also a reaction of Latin American countries to try to avoid that after the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62, the Cold War could be extended in Latin America and the Caribbean. So with the Tlatelolco spirit, we continued to try to expand the idea of our security, an area that would be secure for us. I would like to remember that there were other agreements of this kind, like the Rarotonga Treaty of the South Pacific, or the Pelin-Daba Treaty in Africa, and the Bankan Treaty of Southeast Asia. But the fact is that this was something that was started in Tlatelolco in the Latin America 20 years before the next one. So Brazil decided to expand the idea of Tlatelolco to the South Atlantic. And we created somehow this very important unity that most people don't know about, which is the ZOPACAS. It's the Zone of Peace and Cooperation of the South Atlantic, in which we, next slide, please, in which we united the South American countries and the African countries in a zone of peace and cooperation. And the interesting thing there too is that this was possible, obviously, after the end of apartheid, because as we all know, South Africa also had a program of nuclear, of development of nuclear arms. So we signed in 1986, we started this negotiation in the context of the United Nations, and we have created this zone, ZOPACAS, that very few people talk about, but I think it's a very, very important evolution, because as I show you, first it's Tlatelolco in a more symbolic way, then Brazil and Argentina make sure that they can join completely Tlatelolco, and then you have the South Atlantic peace region, and now with the ZOPACAS, we have made sure that our country is defended. Now, I'm not going to go into other kinds of treaties that, as you know, obviously have a very strong impact, like the Mercosur, which is essentially an economic agreement, but that also brought this friendship between Brazil and Argentina and this integration between our economies. On top of simply eliminating problem, we try to create a constructive dimension of our relationship. So the Mercosur is Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay. But I also want to mention that we have also the organization of the Treaty of Amazon Cooperation. And this is also, by the way, it's the only international organization that is in Brazil, has the office in Brazil. The ACTO was negotiated in '78 and was created as an international organization in 1995. And the Secretariat, as I said, is in Brasilia, but it's very interesting how you can see on the Mercosur and in the OTCA, there is a very strong focus on development, but also on environment. And in the Amazon Cooperation Treaty, we wanted to make sure, including to share the science that Brazil had to develop after the very strong international pressure in the 1980s regarding deforestation and the use of the Amazon. We now have the satellites, including the satellites that was launched thanks to the Indian rocket, but we have an institution, which is the INPE, that I think that we can join with the Embrapa and Embraer and others. INPE is another extraordinary institution that has acquired an extraordinary capacity of interpretation of all the satellite images and the information about the Amazon. And INPE shares through the ACTO its information to the Amazonic neighbors. So then there is another diplomatic negotiation that I want to stress that was extremely important for us, which is the law of the sea. As you know, the generation before our generation was very much concentrated on this negotiation of the law of the sea. And we decided that we joined, as Latin Americans, we joined to propose the 200 miles. The 200 miles is a Latin American idea. In fact, it's a Peruvian idea, Chile and Peru, that proposed that in 1947. But the fact is that the 200-mile limit was accepted and discussed starting 58, but now is an acquis of the international community. And this is again a proposal of Latin America as a group that India participated very strongly in the convention. And when we signed it in 1982, we will all agree that the 200 miles was an extraordinary contribution to the international relations. But there is a dimension of the United Nations Law of the Sea Agreement, is that we have to admit that it's thanks to diplomacy that Brazil and Petrobras has the pre-salt, because the richness of our oil reserves was in fact discovered in high sea, but inside our 200 miles. So it was a diplomatic negotiation that allowed Brazil to be able to explore these waters, for Petrobras to become an expert in deep water research and find our biggest reserves in the Atlantic Ocean. Apart from that one, and since you like energy, I'm going to mention another one of the negotiations that diplomats and with our region and beyond that we negotiated that allowed Brazil to strengthen its development. One is, as you probably know, we negotiated with Germany in the 70s a nuclear energy pact. And this was the beginning of our nuclear program, peaceful nuclear program. So we developed an extraordinary capacity regarding nuclear energy, thanks to this Brazil-Germany agreement of 1974. So again, another important step in our development was assured by a diplomatic negotiation. But then the last I'm going to mention, to stay in my 40 minutes, is the negotiation with Argentina and Paraguay for the construction of the Itaipu Dam in the south of Brazil. In fact, it's exactly on the border of Brazil and Paraguay and very close to Argentina. And this is an experience that I know. I'm ambassador to Bhutan also, and I know that India has negotiations with its neighbors regarding dams. And this is a very interesting experience between Brazil and Paraguay. We built together the Itaipu Dam, and we share 50-50 the energy that is produced. Brazil buys 90% of the part that is the Paraguayan part. So we use 90% of the energy, and this has become the most important source of revenue for Paraguay. So I have a petite histoire about that I think you would like to know. But this dam that we built between our two countries is in fact the largest dam in the world, because the Three Gorges power plant in China is considered to be the largest, but by the production of Itaipu is largest. So Itaipu has an installed capacity of 14 gigawatts, so it's the largest dam in the world, and it's next between Brazil and Paraguay. And the designer, the main designer of this dam was an Indian, Mr. Gurmukh Sarkaria, a very important engineer in the 70s. And he chose the location and the basic design of this dam. This dam, which cost around $20 billion between 75 and 84, was only possible because of after a very difficult negotiation with Argentina, because Argentina considered that it could have an impact on the rivers when they would leave the border between Paraguay and Brazil and enter in Argentina. So this was a very difficult negotiation, but we solved that in '79 with the tripartite agreement that in which Argentina allowed Brazil to develop this dam with Paraguay. So I am going to stop a bit here with my many provocations. I hope my provocation will inspire you to ask me very tough questions. But the fact is that we have so many things to talk about our countries. As an Indian, you know, your country is infinitely interesting. Mine has a much shorter history than yours, but I hope I brought some dimensions of Brazil that were not so obvious, and that I hope you will appreciate. Try to value the importance of diplomacy to achieve what our countries and our people need. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This is Ambassador Bambawale. As the chair of the session, I'm going to take this opportunity to first of all say thank you very much for that presentation. I know that I and my colleagues at the Pune International Center have listened to your presentation with fascination, because there are so many issues which you have touched upon where Brazil and its neighbors are concerned, which are also issues which continue to be important for India and its neighbors down in 2021. And if you permit me, Ambassador, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, but I'll do it one by one. My first question is, you mentioned that Brazil's boundaries were more or less settled by 1909. India, even today in 2021, finds that it has unsettled boundaries, especially on its north, though we have settled boundaries with recently with, say, for example, Bangladesh, and a few other countries. My question to you would be that, is there any advice you would like to give us on how we can settle those boundaries? Ambassador, you're on mute. I think it has gone on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Unmute. The first thing, obviously, that I can say to you is that our experience is that it's always diplomacy that solves the issue. So, and I think that this is very much the Indian position regarding these issues. But I cannot compare the complexity of our neighborhood and your neighborhood, and also the fact that your independence came in 47. So we are talking about borders that you see, if you take the timeline, we became independent in 1822, but we only negotiated with our neighbors the final borders almost 80, 90 years later, which is which shows that it is a complex and long process. But anyway, my trust in diplomacy, in spite of 39 years of diplomacy, is still absolutely strong.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador, we greatly value your advice, and we greatly we agree with you that borders can only be settled and resolved through discussions, through negotiations. But we seem to have one of our neighbors who seems to have decided otherwise, who has given up the diplomatic, the negotiations, the discussion, the talking across the table route, and thinks that by moving large armed forces that he or she can coerce us militarily. But anyway, that's an aside. Ambassador, to you, I would like to just move to a question on the Brics, on the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping, and especially because we are going to have we are going to have a summit meeting sometime in the second half of this year in 2021. I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, how do you look at the relevance of Brics today in 2021, especially because of the great contention which is now building up between the United States on the one hand and China on the other, and perhaps maybe the West on one hand and Russia and China on the other hand. So there's this big contention in world politics, in geopolitics, in international politics. So in this situation, in this kind of geopolitical situation, what do you think, what does Brazil think about the significance of Brics?
I'm going to start by quoting a high official of the Foreign Ministry of Japan when I was ambassador to Japan, who once at the end of a dinner, and you know that the Japanese drink a little, they are marvelous, I love the Japanese, but at the end of the dinner they are a bit more talkative, and one of them turned to me at the end of a dinner at the embassy and he told me, "What do nice countries like India and Brazil in Brics?" So I think that one of the strengths of Brics is this friendship between India and Brazil, because I think that we have controlled some let's say, complicated political intentions of some members of the Brics, including in the final declarations of the meetings, etc. We have been, I think, very much at the center of the mandate of Brics, which is to contribute to international relations. Because the origin of Brics, as we all remember, was economic. I mean, it was our countries thought that we were not given enough attention as what our economies had become deserved. And little by little, it became more political. And I think that for both India and Brazil, BRICS has essentially a very important role to play in science and technology, in economics, in financing, including the BRICS Bank, or much more than in having a political view of situations in the world. So Brazil and India, as long as we can use BRICS as its original intention and to use BRICS as a constructive actor in international affairs, I think it is, with all its crises and all the circumstances that we're seeing today, it is still extremely important, because at the moment, you just mentioned the border issue with one of your big neighbors. It's extraordinary how Indian diplomacy can deal at the same time with a very dramatic situation in the border, and at the same time inviting the leader of China to come to India for the BRICS meeting. Why? Because I think that this is the beautiful dimension of diplomacy. People say, no, this is, many authors think, no, this is cynical, whatever. No, we have to use any instrument we have in our hands to defend the interests of our country. And I think that BRICS has some dimensions that are still of interest of India and Brazil, even if probably Russia and probably China would have a much more, let's say, political intentions regarding the group. And South Africa, which is a country that I love very much, but South Africa doesn't have the clout of Brazil and India in that context. South Africa is a fabulous country. They did marvelous things, but the truth is that I think that India and Brazil have a much more clear and let's say coherent and long experience in this vision of the world.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think what I need to do, Ambassador, if you permit us, is to hand over to Mr. Abhay Vaidya, who will then, there are a lot of questions in the chat box, but Abhay, our Associate Director, will direct them at you. Thank you for answering my questions. I give the floor to Abhay, please.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bambawale. A very fascinating presentation, Your Excellency. And we've had a number of questions here. One of the first questions is from Mr. Vilas Rajwade. What should Brazil and India do together in the short term and the long term for fighting the pandemic and for sustained economic growth?
Yeah. So I think that I hinted a bit at that in my presentation, that I think that our two countries are at the same time, we know our countries, and we know that our countries have achieved unbelievably positive things, but still recognize that they still have very serious challenges. But the challenges don't disqualify the positive achievements that our countries have achieved. So I am afraid a little that there is like almost a desire to see that both India and Brazil had a very big difficulty with the COVID, which, by the way, is true. But look at the irony of everything, is that what do we have as assets in Brazil, and that we can share with India, obviously? We have the largest unified health system in the developing world. We have full coverage of our population with this unified system of health called SUS. And this unified system has somehow prepared Brazil for many of the health challenges that we had. As you remember, recently we had challenges with other diseases, including we had during the Olympics, before the Olympics, we had a very great threat that was very well controlled by the system. Somehow, Brazil was the victim of one factor that differentiates enormously Brazil and India, is that our two factories that are producing vaccines are both state-owned. One is the central state, the center government that owns it, it's the Oswaldo Cruz, and the state of São Paulo, which is the richest state, owns the other one, the Bhutan. So the production of vaccines could only be started after the approval of these vaccines, after many of the bureaucratic dimensions, that if you don't fulfill that as a civil servant, you cannot start producing a vaccine that is not for sure. Now, India, on the other side, has the extraordinary achievement of becoming the most important producer of medicines and vaccines in the world. And in great part, thanks to private companies. And by the way, for instance, the company in your city, Serum, started to produce vaccines. And you remember when the vaccine was approved, they already had produced 50 million vaccines. Why? Because it is a private company and it decided to bet on something that was a brilliant business bet. There is no doubt about it. Then Barrett is also a private company. So we have a situation in which we ended up creating a debate about which one is better. And my conclusion is that both should happen in both our countries. We should have national production and we should have private production, because if Brazil had private production, we would have started to have vaccines before. But the issue of the vaccines is one of the dimensions. And I know that you are at the center of the discussion. And I know that Mr. Bambawale is the most debated personality in India today. But the fact is that Serum Institute is an extraordinary achiever in what it has succeeded to do, and by the way that they dealt with it. But what happened to India was this incredible surge of this new variant. I know that there are still many questions, and we know that maybe there were mistakes by local governments, by state governments, or by even by the national government. But the fact is that the circumstance that is attacking India at this moment is something that is simply unheard anywhere else. And by the way, that is why the World Health Organization has declared that it is an international threat, because if this variant comes to any other country, I think that we're going to have a situation that can be very much similar to what is happening in India. So what I think is that we have to work together. I think Mr. Bambawale mentioned that we had this cooperation between the government of India and the government of Brazil, first with hydroxychloroquine, but later with the vaccine. But the fact is that we realized that we don't control fully what we need to combat a pandemic like this one. And this is a realization that is particularly complex for India and Brazil, because India and Brazil had, after the war, since your independence, and Brazil since the war, we have an economy that has always been sustained by self-reliance. We wanted to have import substitution. We wanted to have only the products that we could produce at home. Even if we couldn't have something, we wouldn't import. We would only have it if it was homemade. And we had this dream, let's say, throughout the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And by different circumstances, in 1991, both our countries in the same year had to open its economy. And neither India nor Brazil planned this opening. This opening had to be done in an emergency way, in the circumstances of emergency. And we never planned this country with a balance between what were our dreams and what the economy, the modern economy, asks of our country. So I think this is the key of our cooperation, is how our countries, facing the challenges that we both are having in this in the COVID pandemic, how this can somehow give us a line that we have to follow to the degree of autonomy that we need, the degree of liberalization that we need. I think that this is a great opportunity for the economists, the good economists in our country, to really think of a model of development that incorporates all the necessities that this crisis has proved that our countries didn't have.
So indeed, very insightful observations about the situation in India and the COVID manufacturing and the healthcare system that you spoke of in India and Brazil. This brings me to the next question, which is about, you of course touched upon the Brazilian satellite being launched by an Indian rocket and a dam being constructed by an Indian. And we have a question here about areas of people to people, institution to institution, and government to government cooperation between India and Brazil, sir.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say to you that this is one of the most frustrating areas for me, I have to tell you, because all Brazilians that studied in America or in England generally comes back with his best friend is an Indian, and vice versa. The Indians are friends of Brazilians when they study, or as the example that was given, when they work together at the IMF or at the World Bank or at the UN or at WTO. We have this enormous empathy. But this is not translated in the relationship between our institutions. Our institutions still have a subconscious that since we are developing, we should deal with the developed. I think this is something that is very hard to say, and it's very sad to say, but there is something in that we have to break. And the recent visit of the Ministry of Science and Technology was an extraordinary alarm call for all his delegation, because they in the last day they told me, it's amazing, we have much more to talk to the Indian institutions than to the Americans or the European institutions. We have to exchange experiences because we have to deal with circumstances that the Americans and the Europeans and the Japanese don't know anymore. They simply don't understand the problems that we have. The new generation, when I was living in Japan, I used to joke that the new generations in Japan, the concept of poverty, the concept of inequality, the concept of lacking material things was something that they looked at me, they didn't even understand what I was talking about. So I think that this is, I believe, what is missing most in our relation is a bridge between our institutions. But it's very, very difficult to do. Why? In great part because both in Brazil and in India, the advanced institutions have very little budget for this kind of thing. And that's why we end up having agreements with institutions that have more resources than our own institutions. But we have to find a way, including I was thinking of talking to the new president of the Brics Bank, of the new development bank, something in that line, which would be some kind of support for institutions between the countries of BRICS, and obviously I'm thinking about India and Brazil, to be able to finance this, making sure that these institutions can have agreements that brings results. Beyond the wonderful human dimension that we know that is natural and is easy. The difficult part is to really implement this association between our institutions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Srinivas Kelkar has a question about the great diversity within the BRICS. So the question is that China is growing by leaps and bounds. India's economy has been affected by the COVID pandemic. Brazil appears to be neutral. South Africa is not doing well, and not much is known about Russia. So is this good for a small group of just 5 countries?
Well, I answered a little of that when I answered the first question, but let me come back to that to take the opportunity to remember that we have a series of agreements, plurilateral agreements, in which our 2 countries are, which are obviously IBSA that was already mentioned, which has only South Africa, India, and Brazil. But I also would like to remember the G4, in which we are also together. I would like to mention also the BASIC, the group in which we negotiate climate change, and the G20, and we have lots of these plurilateral structures in which we work together. The interesting thing is that when we look, except for the regional institutions, Brazil and India are in all of them. It's the only countries that are in all of them. So I think we have to learn how to better use each one of them. We cannot expect them to be a marriage, a perfect marriage that is going to work on all the issues. We have, I think, to concentrate. How can we use that institution for something that is going to be beneficial to all? And I think that we still have a lot of things in the BRICS that we can work together to use in favor of the 5 members.
Your Excellency, one question related to the environment. What steps is Brazil taking to safeguard the Amazon?
Okay, so this is one of my favorite subjects because I worked with this area for 15 years. So I promise you I'm not going to have a 40-minute answer to that question, but let me put to you very clearly what the international pressure regarding the Amazon started in the 1970s and was particularly strong in the late 80s. And Brazil, like India, and you will understand very well our position, Brazil decided in the 80s that the best way to face these criticisms was to be good at it. So we reached the conclusion that we needed to have the scientists, the academics, the institutions, the satellites, the presence, to make sure that Brazil was legitimately the biggest expert in our Amazon. And that's what we achieved in the late 80s and early 90s. So one of the great sources of pride that you can imagine is that all the statistics that the NGOs or the United States or the European Union are using to talk about the deforestation in the Amazon are given by the Brazilian government, because we have very advanced institutions like INPE that I mentioned that are measuring and working on that. What happens is, I come back to the issue of the size. The Amazon forest, the Amazon biome, that's the biome, not the political Amazon that is a larger side of the Brazilian territory. But the Amazonic biome, the forest, is larger than entire India. The Amazon inside Brazil is larger than entire India. So imagine the kind of infrastructure you need to deal with fires in the territory of India, to deforestation in a territory of the size of India. So if you have the infrastructure in Pune and the fire is in Bangalore or the fire is in Gujarat, how do you manage to make sure that you can have this infrastructure working for the entire region? Now, the population of the Amazon is very limited. In the Amazonic biome, it's probably 8 million people. There is no doubt that there must be an intelligent, contemporary way of facing the issue of the Amazon. The Amazon is, at the same time, extremely important for climate change because as a sink, but it is also extremely important in biodiversity. And the richness of the Amazon is still completely unknown. I mean, most of the plants and the things that you find in the Amazon, we still have not defined how to use them. So the conservation of the Amazon is a very important element. But the development of the Amazon in a sustainable way is the other key issue. And this is where technology and science and technology are going to give the best answers. So I think that the evolution of the Amazon situation is obviously has a dimension of law enforcement because the legislation is there. That is very clear. We have the toughest environmental legislation. But as we all know, unfortunately, legislation without law enforcement is far from what we need. So we need to strengthen the law enforcement, and we need to have a forward thinking on how to best use the Amazon for the development of our country and the development of the world. And preservation is a very important part of it. So I believe that with the institutions we have and with the legislation we have and with the strengthening of the law enforcement and with the development of science and technology, I believe that in a very short number of years, the Amazon can become the source of very good news and not only of the bad news that you are reading in the paper, and that I cannot avoid to say that it's true. The deforestation has increased in recent years, but what I believe is that we know the answers, and it's a decision of the government to pursue that. And by the way, my president in the summit that President Biden invited, by the way, also obviously Prime Minister Modi, but in the climate change summit last month, my president put it very clearly that it is a commitment of his government to make sure that we're going to end illegal deforestation and that we are going to make sure that we can become carbon neutral by 2050. As he declared. This is a very important debate, by the way, that India is still very much discussing that issue. China presented 2060, the European Union, the US 2050, and in the Biden meeting, my president committed to 2050.
Truly amazing, Your Excellency. Your presentation has received a wonderful response, and Mr. Pankaj Malhotra has said that the ambassador has made a compelling case of South America as a peaceful region. And Professor Anupam Saraf has expressed his thanks for the fascinating history of South America that you've given. We run out of time for questions, so I will hand over back to the chair, Ambassador Bambawale, for your closing remarks, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ambassador, I worked in India's diplomatic service for 34 years, but unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity. I didn't get the opportunity to travel to your lovely country, to Brazil. Never been there. And, I had a lot of questions in my mind about Brazil, about Brazil's relationships with its neighbors, about Brazil and India relations, about Brazil's place in the world. And your presentation today has been absolutely fascinating, not just for me, but for all of us from the Pune International Center. You've been an excellent ambassador. You've brought Brazil home to us here in Pune. And I want to thank you for that, because it's been absolutely fascinating to listen to everything that you have said, not just about Brazil and its neighbors, about Brazil's history, but also about contemporary geopolitics, about Brics, about climate change, etc., etc. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I think I reflect the feeling and opinion of all of us from the Pune International Center who have been part of this, this meeting this afternoon. I would like to mention that, the Pune International Center has a very, as you have realized in these last hour and a half, 90 minutes or so, that we have a huge number of people who are interested in national security, in economic development issues. So if one of the points that you made is that there is a need for greater people-to-people, institution-to-institution linkage between our two countries, and if you think that there is a speaker in Brazil who would like to reach out to an audience in Pune, India, we would be very happy to host someone like that. One idea which I have in my mind is that we would be delighted to have a virtual interaction with the current Brazilian president of the Brics Bank, who followed our own president when after his 5-year term. So this is something which I have in mind, but we will reach out to you, in the coming months and coming weeks. We also do a major economic conference in February over 3 days. It was virtual this year. And we would, the next session, the next edition will be in the end of February 2022. But we would like to see, even virtually, if that is possible, participation from someone in Brazil, not just from the government, but also from outside the government, from the non-governmental organizations in that conference. So I leave those two ideas and thoughts with you.
Very good.
I would also, we are living in difficult times. We don't know when this pandemic is going to taper down, when travel across India will be possible once again for you. But we definitely would like to have you here with us in Pune, and we can draw up a program for you for over a day and a half, maybe even 2 days, with the Chamber of Commerce in Pune. I leave that open-ended as something which we could work on depending on the situation. But let me say that it's been absolutely fascinating to listen to you. We have been spellbound. Thank you for being such an excellent ambassador of Brazil to India.
Thank you.
And we look forward to interacting with you again. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for participating in the Ambassador Speaks series of the Pune International Center. With those words, Ambassador, on behalf of all of us, including Ambassador Gokhale, our President, Dr. Mashelkar, our Vice President, Dr. Kelkar, let me extend a big thank you to you and a warm welcome in the very near future. Hopefully, we'll be able to overcome this pandemic soon. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you very, very much. And beware, I'm going to come to Pune and visit you.
Absolutely. We want you to come, Ambassador.
Wonderful.
It's from the bottom of our hearts. And we hope you can do that soon, because that will mean we have conquered the pandemic together, not just India,
absolutely,
but the globe as a whole.
Thank you. All the very best for all of you. And thank you for your patience. It was an enormous pleasure. And thank you for the questions.
Thank you. And
thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you, Dr. Mashelkar. Thank you to our backend team, Amresh and Kiran. Thank you, Chair Ambassador Bambawale. And thank you, Dr. Gokhale, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, for organizing and helping us organize this event. With this, I declare the event closed. A recording of this session will be available on YouTube. You may please visit the Pune International Center website and you will have the recording tomorrow. Thank you very much.